The sun hung low over the manicured lawns of Willow Creek, a suburban enclave where every hedge was trimmed to perfection and every mailbox stood at precisely the same height. In this pristine neighborhood, the Homeowners Association ruled with an iron grip, their rulebook thicker than a phone directory and enforced with the zeal of a medieval inquisition. For Jack Thornton, a retired Secret Service agent who had spent 2 decades protecting the nation's most powerful figures, this was supposed to be a quiet retreat. He had traded high-stakes missions for a modest 2-story home, a place to raise his 6-year-old daughter Lily, and finally breathe. But Willow Creek was no sanctuary. It was a battlefield, and Jack was about to learn that the HOA's enforcers were as relentless as any threat he'd faced in his career. Jack had moved to Willow Creek 6 months ago, drawn by the promise of good schools and a safe community for Lily. His days of scanning crowds for threats and memorizing escape routes were behind him, or so he thought. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a crisp, cream-colored envelope slid under his door. Inside, a letter from the HOA cited non-compliant backyard structures and demanded immediate removal of Lily's playhouse, a bright yellow wooden structure Jack had built himself, complete with a tiny slide and a swing. It was Lily's castle, her escape into a world of imagination. To the HOA, it was an eyesore that violated Section 4.2, subsection B of their sacred bylaws. No unapproved structures exceeding 5 feet in height. Jack measured the playhouse. It stood at 5 feet 2 inches. He ignored the letter, assuming it was a mistake. After all, he'd dealt with far worse than nosy neighbors, cartel operatives, rogue agents, even a bomb threat at a state dinner. A playhouse dispute was laughable, but the HOA wasn't laughing. A second letter arrived, this time with a fine of $200 and a warning that further action would be taken. Jack's training kicked in. He didn't negotiate with petty tyrants. He tossed the letter into a drawer and went about his life, helping Lily with her homework and teaching her how to throw a perfect spiral with a football. The HOA, however, was not accustomed to being ignored. Its president, Barbara Whitaker, a woman with a perm as rigid as her personality, had made it her mission to maintain Willow Creek's aesthetic integrity. Barbara was the kind of person who measured grass blades with a ruler and sent violation notices for slightly faded patio cushions. She had eyes everywhere, neighbors who reported infractions in exchange for her favor, a network of busybodies who thrived on control. When Jack didn't comply, Barbara escalated. She convened an emergency HOA meeting where the board voted unanimously to resolve the Thornton issue by any means necessary. One humid Saturday morning, Jack woke to the sound of metal clanging in his backyard. He bolted upright, instincts flaring. Through the window, he saw 2 men in khaki vests with Willow Creek HOA enforcement, stitched in bold letters. They were prying at Lily's playhouse with crowbars, their faces set in grim determination. Jack's pulse quickened, not with fear but with the cold clarity of a man who had faced down armed threats. He slipped on his boots, grabbed his phone, and stepped outside, his movements deliberate like a predator assessing its prey. The enforcers didn't notice him at first. They were too busy wrestling with the playhouse's foundation, muttering about stubborn bolts and non-compliant paint. Jack stood at the edge of his patio, arms crossed, his 6-foot frame casting a long shadow. When one of the men finally looked up, he froze, clearly unprepared for the intensity in Jack's eyes. Jack didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence was enough, a quiet menace honed over years of guarding presidents. He asked what they were doing. The men stammered, citing HOA orders to remove the structure. They showed him a clipboard with Barbara's signature scrawled at the bottom. Jack's jaw tightened. Breaking into his property was a line crossed, a challenge to his instincts as a protector. He told them to leave. They hesitated, exchanging nervous glances, but ultimately retreated, their tools clattering as they fled through the side gate. Jack watched them go, his mind already mapping out the next steps. This wasn't just about a playhouse anymore. It was about his daughter's happiness, his home, and his right to live without being harassed. He spent the afternoon installing motion sensor cameras around his property, a precaution from his old life that felt necessary again. By evening, Lily was back in her playhouse, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing, but Barbara wasn't done. The next day, Jack received an email from the HOA, accusing him of hostile behavior toward their enforcement team and threatening legal action. Attached was a grainy photo of Jack standing on his patio, looking every bit the formidable operative he once was. The email demanded compliance within 48 hours or face escalated measures. Jack's lips curled into a faint smile. He knew escalation. He'd lived it. If Barbara wanted a war, she'd get one, but it would be on his terms. He began his counteroffensive with precision. First, he reviewed the HOA bylaws, combing through the fine print like he once analyzed security briefings. He found loopholes, ambiguities in the rules about temporary structures and emergency enforcement protocols. The HOA's own obsession with bureaucracy would be its weakness. Next, he reached out to an old contact from the Secret Service, a lawyer named Mike who specialized in property disputes. Mike confirmed what Jack suspected. The HOA had no legal right to enter his property without consent or a court order. Their actions were trespassing, plain and simple. Jack didn't stop there. He cross-referenced county records and discovered that Barbara's own backyard gazebo, a hulking monstrosity of lattice and fairy lights, violated the same height restrictions she'd weaponized against him. The hypocrisy fueled his resolve. He drafted a formal complaint to the county, citing Barbara's violation and the HOA's illegal entry onto his property. He attached time-stamped footage from his cameras, showing the enforcer's intrusion in crisp detail. The complaint was a warning shot, but Jack knew it wouldn't end there. Barbara's ego wouldn't allow her to back down. As the days passed, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Some residents sided with Jack, tired of the HOA's overreach. Others, loyal to Barbara, saw him as a troublemaker threatening their perfect community. Jack didn't care about their opinions. He cared about Lily, who still played in her yellow castle, oblivious to the growing tension. But late one night, as Jack reviewed his camera footage, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure in a dark hoodie lingering near his backyard fence, their face obscured. They didn't touch the playhouse, but their presence was no accident. Someone was watching. The realization hit Jack like a bullet. This wasn't just about rules anymore. It was personal. Barbara, or someone acting on her orders, was testing him, probing for weaknesses. Jack's old instincts surged back. Scan, assess, neutralize. He upgraded his security, adding floodlights and reinforcing the gate. He didn't sleep that night, his mind racing through scenarios, each one darker than the last. Willow Creek was no longer a quiet suburb. It was a chessboard, and Jack was ready to make his next move. The standoff was far from over, and the HOA was about to learn what happens when you cross a man who once stood between a president and a bullet. The air in Willow Creek grew thicker with tension, as if the neighborhood itself sensed the brewing conflict. Jack Thornton, once a shadow in the corridors of power, now stood at the center of a suburban war. The HOA's audacity, breaking into his yard to target Lily's playhouse, had ignited something primal in him. His years in the Secret Service had taught him to anticipate threats, to see the world as a series of calculated risks. Now those skills were aimed squarely at Barbara Whitaker and her army of clipboard-wielding enforcers. Jack's complaint to the county had landed like a grenade. Within days, a county inspector arrived at Barbara's home, measuring her gazebo with a tape measure while she watched from her porch, her face a mask of barely concealed fury. The inspector confirmed the violation, issuing Barbara a notice to remove or modify her structure within 30 days. The news spread through Willow Creek like wildfire, neighbors whispering over picket fences about the HOA president's hypocrisy. Jack didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The first blow had been struck, and he was already planning the next. But Barbara was no amateur. She'd ruled Willow Creek for a decade, her influence woven into every cul-de-sac and garden bed. She rallied her loyalists, framing Jack as a rogue outsider who threatened their community's values. At the next HOA meeting, held in the clubhouse under fluorescent lights, she painted a vivid picture of chaos. Unchecked playhouses, rogue lawn ornaments, a neighborhood descending into anarchy. The board nodded along, their faces grim, as if Jack's 5'2" playhouse was the harbinger of societal collapse. They voted to double down, issuing Jack a new fine of $500 for obstructing enforcement and scheduling a second attempt to remove the playhouse. Jack anticipated this. He'd spent his career reading opponents, predicting their moves. He knew Barbara wouldn't retreat. She was too entrenched, too obsessed with control. So he fortified his defenses. He installed a keypad lock on the backyard gate and added a silent alarm that would ping his phone if triggered. He also began documenting everything, every letter, every email, every violation notice. His dining room table became a war room, covered in files and legal pads, a stark contrast to Lily's crayons and coloring books scattered nearby. One evening, as Jack reviewed his notes, his phone buzzed with an alert. The backyard camera had detected motion. He opened the live feed and saw two figures, not the khaki-vested enforcers this time, but strangers in dark clothing, their faces hidden by baseball caps. They carried bolt cutters and a flashlight, moving toward the playhouse with purpose. Jack's heart pounded, not with fear but with the clarity of action. He grabbed a flashlight of his own and slipped into the backyard, moving silently, his body low to the ground. The intruders didn't hear him approach. They were focused on the playhouse, one of them tugging at the slide while the other scanned the yard with the flashlight. Jack activated his floodlights, bathing the scene in harsh white light. The intruders froze, caught like deer in headlights. Jack stepped forward, his voice low but commanding, ordering them to drop their tools and leave. They bolted, scrambling over the fence, leaving behind a bolt cutter and a crumpled HOA violation notice. Jack retrieved the paper. It was unsigned, but the language mirrored Barbara's previous letters. The incident confirmed Jack's suspicions. Barbara was escalating, possibly hiring outsiders to do her dirty work. He filed a police report, citing trespassing and vandalism, and sent the footage to his lawyer, Mike. The police were sympathetic but cautious, noting that HOA disputes often stayed civil. Jack knew better. This was no longer about rules. It was a power struggle, and Barbara was playing dirty. He decided to take the fight to her doorstep. Using his old contacts, Jack dug into Barbara's past. He discovered she'd been sued twice before in other neighborhoods for similar overreaches. Once for fining a family over a wheelchair ramp, another for trying to foreclose on a home over unpaid HOA dues. Both cases settled out of court, but they painted a picture of a woman who thrived on control and intimidation. Jack also learned that the HOA's funds, meant for community upkeep, were suspiciously low. An audit hadn't been conducted in years. He requested one from the county, citing mismanagement, and sent an anonymous tip to a local news blog known for exposing petty scandals. The blog ran with the story, publishing an article titled "Willow Creek HOA Tyranny or Tidiness." The piece detailed Barbara's gazebo violation, the break-in at Jack's property, and questions about the HOA's finances. Neighbors began to talk openly, their loyalty to Barbara fraying. Some stopped paying dues, others demanded transparency. Barbara, cornered, lashed out with a mass email accusing Jack of slander and vowing to protect the community's standards. But her grip was slipping, and Jack could sense it. Still, the shadowy figure from his camera footage haunted him. He didn't tell Lily, who still played happily in her castle, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Barbara had more planned. Late one night, as he checked the locks, his phone pinged again. Another motion alert. This time, the camera showed nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of the playhouse. But Jack's gut told him something was wrong. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, his senses on high alert. The yard was still, too still. As he approached the playhouse, he noticed a faint chemical smell. Paint thinner. Someone had doused the wooden structure, the liquid pooling in the grass. A matchbook lay nearby, unlit but deliberate. Jack's blood ran cold. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a threat to his home, his daughter. He extinguished the danger, but the message was clear. Barbara or her proxies were willing to burn his world down to win. The war was far from over, and Jack was ready to fight fire with fire. If you're hooked on this wild HOA saga, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell for the next chapter. Trust me, you won't believe what happens next.